Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced and you're listening to the Web Development Podcast. And I got a question on my newest episode. And if you'd like to ask me a question to answer on a future episode, all you got to do is join the community. Head over to devnursery.com, D-E-V, nursery.com, and join either the Discord or the Slack channel. We have both, and I'm on Discord and Slack all day because I work developing, and so those are both open on my. So feel free to send me a message and ask me a question or something you would like to see me cover on this podcast. So go join that over there at devnursery.com, either the Slack or the Discord community. And again, there's a lot of other developers already there, so people to talk to. So let's do that. Let's build that community up. But the question was sort of, what is the future of JavaScript what are my thoughts on WASM, WebAssembly? So first let's discuss what is WebAssembly. WebAssembly is sort of the fourth language that browsers interpret. So for the longest time, there was just three things that browsers could understand: HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. That was it. Then a few years ago, they literally, like almost overnight, which is like unheard of, everybody kind of agreed that there was a demand for other languages in the browser, but making browsers understand Python, Ruby, Rust, all individually would just seem like the browsers would get bulky, browsers would get slow. So what they did is they created a new sort of low-level compile target built into browsers. This is called WebAssembly. So it's essentially a new language, but you're not going to build your websites in WebAssembly. What's going to happen is that you will build tools that will take code in other languages and compile it to WebAssembly in the same way that your C++ compiler compiles code to normal assembly language. You'll have compilers that compile code to WebAssembly. And far as I'm aware at the moment, the two languages sort of furthest along in this process of being able to actually compile to WebAssembly are Rust and C#, or really .NET. Okay, so I think you can use pretty much anything in .NET within the Blazor framework, and then what the Blazor framework does, it doesn't compile your code to WebAssembly at the moment. That's eventually the goal, but I think right now what it does is that it in WebAssembly it creates a .NET runtime in the browser. So essentially, a .NET runtime is running in the browser, interpreting your C#, F#, or VBNet code live in the browser. So now you can essentially build your front end in .NET code. You don't need HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. You can just use Blazor and do all of that in Blazor. And then Rust, I think, has something along the lines of the same idea too. Although I don't think Rust would necessarily be, wouldn't be necessarily a replacement for HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, nor probably Blazor. I mean, Blazor is going to make sense if you're working in the .NET environment. Okay, so Blazor makes sense if you have a team of .NET developers that, hey, why not just use Blazor? It probably is going to be interoperable in the .NET framework in a very nice, smooth way. But if you're using Ruby on Rails, there really isn't much reason to use Blazor on your front end, or if you're using Python or something else for your back end other than a back end built in C#, F#. So in that case, I don't think Blazor is going to displace JavaScript, nor do I think anything is going to displace JavaScript. JavaScript is hell of a language in the sense that it's evolved to actually a fairly elegant, pleasant to develop in language over the years. Okay, it's not your father's JavaScript anymore. Okay, all the weird semantical issues, syntactical issues that made it really kind of odd compared to other languages are no longer there, and its functionality has extended into mobile, into desktop. So the thing is that the demand for JavaScript development is now outside of the browser, and that only reinforces its demand inside of the browser. Because, hey, if I'm already using JavaScript and React Native to develop mobile applications, why not continue building my front ends using JavaScript? So I think the JavaScript inertia, the JavaScript ecosystem is so robust at this point, I don't see it ever sort of losing its spot anytime soon unless something really amazing happens. Like, there would just have to be some sort of killer application. Like, I can see things like maybe over time, Deno having its own sort of a much Deno, which is an evolution from Node, having sort of maybe an equal footing as Node. I don't think Deno will replace Node, because people who built the entire websites on Node, the benefits that Deno gives you doesn't necessarily give you any reason to really rebuild your entire website. They're nice features that Deno has added, but they're not necessarily sufficient for you to like redo everything. But if you're creating a new project, Deno might offer you enough nice new features regarding security, and over time there'll be enough new libraries there as people try to be sort of the first to provide, libraries in that space, that, why not enjoy the benefits that Deno gives you of being able to kind of work directly in TypeScript and stuff like that. So in that same way, I think WebAssembly will create sort of new ecosystems that will be sizable. Like, I think Blazor will breathe further life into .NET in the web development space, but I don't think .NET will ever be sort of like what consumer websites are like. Like, I don't see Bill Smith building his restaurant's website in .NET. This is more like large corporate enterprise websites, like bank websites and whatnot. I mean, for medium to small applications or startups, I don't think it necessarily makes as much sense to use .NET, because it's there is a lot of overhead as far as like what you need to know to use .NET. And developers in .NET tend to be a little bit more expensive, as far as I understand it. So you're better off using things like Ruby, Python, JavaScript, where you'll find a lot more developers. So developers are more affordable. They have really robust communities and ecosystems, and it's a little bit easier to kind of get jump started because there's a lot more sort of that hobby, casual community there. Cool. And I mean, the thing is that this is not like this whole idea of like compiling to WASM isn't necessarily like a new idea either. Before WASM, there was transpilers to transpile code into JavaScript. There still is. I mean, TypeScript is transpiled into JavaScript. CoffeeScript was transpiled into JavaScript. ReasonML is transpiled into JavaScript. The JavaScript implementation of OCaml is transpiled into JavaScript. So there's a lot of different languages, and there's like Jython that transpiles like Python to JavaScript. So the idea of trying to create the ability for other languages to be used in the front end isn't new. Now, of course, transpiling to JavaScript doesn't have the same value proposition as compiling to WASM, because WASM being sort of low level allows you to do stuff that's a lot faster. And that's where it gets interesting. And the idea of having like actual full-on, like, let's say, video games and 3D rendered spaces running out of the browser, that's more of a possibility. And I think that's where you're going to see WASM really shine, and like languages that compile to WASM really shine in places where basically JavaScript just can't produce applications that are fast enough to handle the level of processing of the most highest processing intensive stuff, which isn't most things. Like, again, your local restaurant's website works perfectly fine in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Like, there really isn't a reason to use something else, okay, just because it's shiny and new. But yeah, I do expect that there will be eventually a Python to WASM compiler, a Ruby to WASM compiler, and there will be people who just decide to use a particular language full stack. They might just build their whole website using Ruby. They might build their whole website using Python back to front. I don't think that'll become the norm, because again, the community, the resources, and using HTML, CSS, JavaScript in the front, web component libraries in React, Vue, and Angular, Svelte. Like, there's just so many tools, so many things that just make life very pleasant. That's essentially like what Elm was for. Elm was supposed to be is supposed to make developing in the front end like less buggy and more pleasant. And Elm does kind of have a cool syntax, because it's really a language designed for one purpose: building reactive front ends. But again, the benefits of using Elm don't always outweigh the difficulty of learning Elm. Okay, in a sense, like the fact that you can do stuff in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and there's a lot of community, there's a lot of resources, a lot of supplemental stuff, offers you a lot of benefit, despite, having to deal with maybe some more runtime errors and some trickier debugging than necessarily learning sort of the more functional approach of an Elm programming language. And that's, why Elm isn't a huge thing. Elm is pretty cool. Everyone I know who uses Elm or have seen that has learned it and tried it and put it into practice is very happy with it. But for most people, the added value isn't enough the cost isn't worth the benefit. And that's just generally how these things work. So that's my thoughts on WASM. I think WASM will create some killer applications. I think particularly in let's say 3D rendered spaces and possibly in browser or gaming, also in the enterprise, and in websites that maybe otherwise would run slower because there's just so much going on in the front end. But for the vast majority of web applications, the having to sort of redo how you do things versus what you'll get out of it probably won't, the cost benefit won't be there. So that's my thoughts on it. So I definitely think it's worth being familiar and keeping an eye on that space. I think it's I like keeping track of all these different technologies, but again, just because the technology isn't going to dominate the world someday doesn't necessarily mean it's not worth knowing or won't be valuable to learn, because it will be useful somewhere, and WASM will create all sorts of new niches that we just don't know yet. Because until all people are still building those compilers, and once that ability to compile to WASM is there, people will discover what this new speed, this new world can bring, and then it might make some new possibilities quite interesting. But JavaScript is still always going to be sort of king of your sort of traditional website front end for as long as it wants to be. At best, maybe someone creates a TypeScript. If anything, they'll probably create new JavaScript interpreters that compile to WASM and make JavaScript that much faster. Or a TypeScript to WASM compiler, so that way people can use TypeScript natively in the browser, which would be actually really cool, because then you really have scalable JavaScript in the browser, and that you're not transpiling, it's in the browser natively, and so you can test out the code at runtime. You don't have to compile every time you want to test. It would just be a smoother experience using TypeScript, and that would actually be really cool. I'd be shocked if Microsoft isn't already working on this. My name is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com. Again, if you want to ask me a question, go join the community, Discord or Slack over there at devnursery.com. My name is Alex Merced. Have a great day and enjoy.